red and blue lights shattered the quiet darkness in an instant. The colors painted the asphalt and trees in violent flashes. The siren cut through the evening air with a sound that transformed everything it touched. For some people, a traffic stop is merely a frustrating delay, a brief interruption of their evening plans. But when an officer with a badge, a loaded weapon, and a mind clouded by deep-seated prejudice spots an elderly black man driving a pristine luxury vehicle, something shifts. The air changes. A routine patrol becomes a powder keg waiting to explode. The officer's name was Bradley Jenkins. He was 34 years old, thick-necked, and carried himself with a permanent tight-jawed scowl that he mistook for authority. Jenkins had been with the Fairhaven Police Department for 12 years. 12 years of learning exactly where the lines were and exactly how to step right up to the edge of them without getting caught. He had a specific profile he looked for on these quiet evening shifts. He did not like outsiders in his town. He did not like people who didn't fit the picture he'd created of what belonged here. Tonight, he was restless. His shift had been boring, filled with the kind of nothing that made his skin itch. He'd been drumming his fingers against the steering wheel for hours, his eyes scanning the empty, winding stretches of the road, waiting for something. Anything. And then he saw it. A vehicle that didn't belong. A driver who didn't belong. The opportunity he'd been waiting for. About 3 miles away, a man named Marcus Webb was simply trying to get home. He was 61 years old, though his bearing made him seem older in some ways, and younger in others. There was a quality to him that came from a lifetime of carrying weight that shouldn't have been his to carry. He'd spent the last few hours with his daughter and his grandchildren at a birthday dinner in the city. One of those rare evenings where family obligations actually felt like a gift. His daughter had driven separately. Now Marcus was making the drive back home alone. Just him and his thoughts and the soft hum of his restored Mercedes-Benz. The car was his pride and joy. He'd restored it over the course of 6 years. A midnight blue beauty that turned heads everywhere he went. It represented something to him. Not wealth, though the car certainly cost money. It represented his refusal to be diminished by circumstance or expectation. It was a small rebellion against invisibility. Marcus drove with the careful precision of a man who respected the road. He kept his speed exactly at the posted limit. He signaled every turn. He centered himself in his lane. He was a man who understood that in this country, driving while black meant following rules that no one else had to follow. It meant being hyper-aware, hyper-vigilant, always conscious that a simple mistake could escalate into something much worse. He drove the way his father had taught him to drive, the way his father had survived driving, the way black men had learned across generations to navigate spaces where their presence was questioned. At mile marker 47, Jenkins' cruiser suddenly pulled onto the highway. Jenkins slammed on the brakes hard enough that the heavy vehicle lurched. He'd been waiting, parked just off the road in an obscured spot, watching for exactly the kind of car that had just passed, watching for exactly the kind of driver. For 2 miles, Jenkins rode directly behind Marcus's car. The headlights blinded the rearview mirror. The cruiser maintained a distance of maybe 10 feet, close enough to be intimidating, close enough to be a threat. Jenkins was waiting. He was waiting for the driver to make a mistake, a sudden brake check, a swerve, a failure to signal, some excuse, some provocation, some justification for what was already decided. But the Mercedes drove flawlessly. It was maddening. Jenkins felt the frustration building in his chest, the way a predator feels when the prey refuses to panic. He didn't need an excuse. He didn't need a reason. Jenkins reached over and flicked the switch. The light bar erupted, painting the dark canopy of the trees in violent flashes of red and blue. The piercing wail of the siren cut through the silent night, a sound designed to set off alarms in the human nervous system, to trigger the primitive fear response. The sound of authority, the sound of control. Marcus didn't panic. He had lived a long time in a world that often judged him before he spoke. He signaled. He slowed his vehicle. He carefully pulled over onto the wide gravel shoulder of the road, ensuring he was completely out of the lane of traffic. He put the car in park. He turned off the engine. He rolled down his driver's side window completely. He placed both of his hands visibly on the top of the steering wheel, and then he waited. He understood what was happening. On some level that didn't require conscious thought, he understood the danger. He'd been taught it his whole life. He understood that the next few minutes might define the rest of his evening, or possibly more. Behind him, Jenkins threw the cruiser into park. He didn't radio dispatch. This was a violation of protocol. He wanted to handle this on his own terms. He unclasped the retaining strap on his holster with a deliberate gesture, a subconscious signal of aggression, and grabbed his heavy maglite flashlight. Stepping out into the cool night air, Jenkins slammed his door hard enough to make the sound carry. He swaggered toward the classic car, ready to assert his dominance. His walk was all power, all swagger. This was his moment. This was where he got to remind someone of their place. The crunch of heavy boots on gravel signaled Jenkins's approach. Marcus kept his eyes forward, watching the officer's silhouette in his side mirror. He could see the aggressive posture, the deliberate heavy steps. Jenkins stopped just behind the driver's side door, standing in Marcus's blind spot deliberately, a tactic designed to force the older man to crane his neck awkwardly, to place himself in a vulnerable position. Then the heavy beam of the maglite blasted through the open window, shining directly into Marcus's eyes. The light was blinding, purposely so. License registration and proof of insurance. Jenkins barked. His voice was laced with unearned authority and thinly veiled contempt. He did not offer a greeting. He did not state the reason for the stop. There were no pleasantries. There was only command. Marcus squinted against the blinding light but did not look away. He kept his hands exactly where they were, visibly on the steering wheel. His voice when he spoke was perfectly measured, radiating a quiet authority that Jenkins immediately found irritating. "Good evening, officer. My license is in my wallet, which is in my left interior jacket pocket. The registration and insurance are in the glove compartment." "May I reach for them?" Jenkins scoffed, shining the light harsher into Marcus's face, sweeping it over the custom leather interior of the vehicle. "Just hand them over and lose the attitude." "Whose car is this old man?" Marcus's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but his voice remained incredibly steady. "The vehicle belongs to me, officer. Now, to be clear, I'm going to reach into my jacket with my left hand to retrieve my wallet. Is that understood?" I said, "Get the documents." Jenkins snapped, stepping closer, his hand resting menacingly on the butt of his sidearm. The gesture was meant to intimidate. It was meant to remind Marcus of what Jenkins had access to, what Jenkins could use, what Jenkins could do. Marcus moved slowly, with deliberate telegraphed motions. He reached into his suit jacket, retrieved a slim leather wallet, extracted his driver's license and handed it out the window. He then leaned over, opened the glove box, retrieved a small folder containing his registration and insurance, passing those out as well. His movements were careful, precise, nothing sudden or threatening. Every motion announced itself. Jenkins snatched the papers. He stepped back a half pace and lowered the flashlight just enough to read the documents. Though he kept the spill of the light on Marcus, he looked at the name, Marcus Webb. He looked at the address. It was a residence in the city not here in Fairhaven, a residential area that Jenkins knew by reputation. Not poor, not wealthy, middle class, professional. Marcus. Jenkins said, using the first name deliberately. A classic power play meant to demean, meant to strip away the formality of Mr. that would have established respect. "What exactly are you doing driving through Fairhaven?" "You are a long way from your neighborhood." "I'm driving home from a dinner with my daughter," Marcus replied smoothly. "Is there a curfew in Fairhaven County that I am unaware of?" Officer Marcus deliberately paused, waiting for the man to identify himself. It was a small assertion of his own dignity, asking the officer to establish himself, to reciprocate the introduction. It was a quiet refusal to accept the power dynamic that Jenkins was trying to establish. "Officer Jenkins," The cop sneered, annoyed by the older man's vocabulary and absolute lack of fear. "And before you ask, I pulled you over because I clocked you swerving back there. Multiple times. Nearly caused an accident." It was a lie. A clean, confident lie. There had been no swerving. There had been no near accident. Marcus had been driving with mechanical precision. But lies are easy when you have a badge. Lies are easy when you know the system will back you up. Marcus knew the lie immediately. He'd learned to recognize them, but he also knew that this moment was fragile. This moment was dangerous. What he did in the next few minutes would determine everything that followed. "I wasn't swerving, officer," Marcus said, his tone remaining calm but with an edge of something new. Not quite confrontation, but an assertion of his own knowledge of what had actually happened. "I've been maintaining steady speed in the center of my lane the entire time. If you reviewed your dashcam footage, you'd see." "You questioning me?" Jenkins interrupted, his voice dropping to something colder, something more threatening. "You questioning what I saw, I'm stating what occurred," Marcus replied. Each word carefully chosen. There was no swerving. There was no traffic violation. "And we both know that." Jenkins' jaw clenched. This was not how these interactions were supposed to go. Usually, by this point, the driver was apologizing, stammering, trying to talk their way out of trouble. They were nervous. They were compliant. They were afraid. This man was none of those things. "Step out of the vehicle," Jenkins commanded, his hand moving to rest on his weapon again. It was a calculated move, a gesture designed to remind Marcus that Jenkins had something Marcus didn't, that Jenkins had power. "May I ask what charge you're stepping me out for?" Marcus asked. "I haven't violated any traffic laws. I haven't committed any crime. What's the legal basis for removing me from my vehicle?" Jenkins' face flushed red. The questioning was infuriating to him. The refusal to simply comply. The assertion of rights. All of it was adding up to something he couldn't tolerate. "You're getting increasingly hostile. You're failing to obey lawful orders. Step out of the vehicle now, or I will remove you from it." But the order wasn't lawful. They both knew it. A traffic stop required reasonable suspicion of a crime. The stop itself had never been based on anything Jenkins had actually observed. Jenkins had simply seen a black man in an expensive car and made a decision. Marcus understood that arguing further was pointless. He understood that the only thing that would end this gracefully was compliance. He unbuckled his seatbelt slowly, opened his door, and stepped out onto the gravel. He kept his hands visible. He kept his movements slow and deliberate. As Marcus stood, he was suddenly aware of just how much smaller he felt than the officer. Jenkins was taller, thicker, younger. Jenkins had the badge and the gun and the authority of the state behind him. Jenkins had the power to do whatever he wanted in this moment, and both men understood that. "Hands on the hood of the vehicle," Jenkins ordered. Feet spread. Marcus complied. He placed his hands on the hood of his precious car and spread his feet apart. He was now in the most vulnerable position imaginable. Exposed. Accessible. Unable to defend himself or move quickly. Jenkins approached from behind him, and Marcus tensed. He knew what was coming. The pat-down began. Jenkins ran his hands over Marcus's body with more aggression than was necessary. The intent wasn't to search for weapons. The intent was to humiliate, to demonstrate power, to make Marcus feel like his body didn't belong to him anymore. Jenkins's hands were rough, invasive, deliberate in their violation of personal space. "You know, Marcus," Jenkins said as he searched, his voice taking on a conversational tone that somehow made it worse. "People like you coming into neighborhoods like this, it doesn't sit right with people. You drive a car like this, people notice, people talk. You understand what I'm saying?" Marcus said nothing. He understood exactly what Jenkins was saying. He understood the code. He understood that people like Jenkins saw his car, his bearing, his quiet dignity, as a kind of transgression. How dare he own something nice? How dare he exist with dignity in spaces where Jenkins had decided he didn't belong? Jenkins completed the search and stepped back. "Vehicle search," he announced. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. Jenkins opened the passenger side door and began looking through the vehicle. He opened the glove compartment and rifled through it. He checked under the seats. He opened the center console and looked there too. He was looking for anything he could use, anything that would justify what was already planned. He found nothing, because there was nothing to find. Marcus Webb was a law-abiding citizen. He'd never been arrested. He'd never been charged with anything. His record was clean. But that didn't matter. That didn't stop Jenkins from standing back and announcing, "I smell marijuana." It was another lie. There was no smell. There was nothing. But Jenkins had invoked the magic words, the words that would justify anything, the words that would be believed. "I need you to stand right here while I call for backup," Jenkins said. "I need to search this vehicle more thoroughly, and you're being detained for suspicion of drug possession." Marcus closed his eyes for just a moment. He understood what was happening. He understood that he was about to be arrested. He understood that the next few hours, possibly the next few days, were going to be very difficult indeed. And he understood that there wasn't anything he could do to stop it. Within minutes, another cruiser arrived. An older officer emerged, one who nodded at Jenkins without question. Jenkins gave him a story that bore almost no resemblance to what had actually happened. He talked about erratic driving. He talked about Marcus's aggressive attitude. He talked about the suspected marijuana odor. The new officer accepted every word without questioning any of it. "I'm going to need to take you in," Jenkins said, his voice now taking on a tone of false regret, as if this was disappointing to him, as if he wished things could have gone differently. "You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute resisting arrest and failure to obey lawful commands." None of it was true. All of it was a lie, but it was all in the report. It would all become official. It would all become part of the record. Marcus was handcuffed. His hands were pulled behind his back and restrained with plastic cuffs that cut into his wrists. He was placed in the back of Jenkins's cruiser. The metal seat was hard and cold. The smell of old coffee and stale human misery filled the interior. A metal partition separated him from Jenkins in the front seat. As Jenkins drove toward the police station, Marcus stared out the window at the passing streetlights. The evening was beautiful. The sky was fading from blue to purple to black. Somewhere out there, his daughter was driving home, unaware that her father had just been arrested on completely fabricated charges. Somewhere out there, his grandchildren were going to sleep, not knowing why Grandpa wasn't going to call tomorrow morning the way he always did. The station was a brick building with fluorescent lights that made everything look vaguely diseased. Jenkins escorted Marcus inside and directly to the booking area. A bored-looking clerk with a nameplate that said Officer Torres looked up from her desk. "What have we got?" Torres asked. "Suspicious vehicle," Jenkins said. "Erratic driving. Suspected drug possession." Had to be pretty firm with him, but he's secured. It was all phrased in the language of authority, but every word was calculated deception. Torres began the booking process. She took Marcus's information. She took his personal items. She confiscated his wallet, his watch, his keys, his phone. She documented everything in a system that would follow him for years. That would become part of his permanent record, even if everything was eventually dismissed. "You get to make one phone call," Torres said, pointing toward a phone mounted on the wall. "Make it quick." Marcus picked up the phone and dialed his daughter's number. She answered on the second ring, still awake, still driving home. "Dad," she said, hearing his voice and immediately knowing something was wrong. "What's happening?" "I've been arrested," Marcus said. His voice remained steady, but she could hear the weight in it. False charges, completely fabricated. "I need you to listen carefully. I need you to call my lawyer. His name is..." "What?" She interrupted him. "Arrested." "Where are you?" "What happened?" "I'll explain everything later. For now, just call my attorney. Tell him I've been arrested in Fairhaven on drug charges. He'll know what to do. I'll be okay. Don't worry." But she was worried. He could hear it in her breathing. and he understood that worry would extend beyond her. It would touch her children. It would ripple outward. Marcus hung up the phone, and Torres escorted him to a cell. It was small, concrete, cold. There were bars on the door. There was a metal bench bolted to the floor. There was a toilet in the corner with no privacy. There were 2 other men in the cell, one sleeping, one watching Marcus with the kind of wariness that comes from a lifetime of dealings with the criminal justice system. Marcus sat on the bench, his hands no longer cuffed, but his freedom completely gone. The cell door slammed shut with a sound that echoed through the building. The sound of finality, the sound of control. Around 11 p.m. that night, Jenkins sat in the station's break room, drinking a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been sitting there since morning. His shift was over, but he wasn't going home yet. He wanted to finish his report while everything was fresh. He wanted to make sure every word was exactly right, every lie perfectly placed, every fabrication reinforced with the authority of his badge. He pulled out his laptop and began typing. He wrote that Marcus Webb had been observed driving erratically. He wrote that Marcus had failed to obey lawful commands. He wrote that Marcus had been aggressive and hostile. He wrote that he had detected the odor of marijuana. He wrote that his safety had been threatened. Every word was calculated to paint Marcus as a criminal and Jenkins as a brave officer doing his duty. He attached a body camera video file, except the video had never been recorded. The camera had malfunctioned, Jenkins wrote. But his narrative was the truth. His account was what mattered. His badge was the credential that made him trustworthy. By the time Jenkins finished the report, was a work of fiction masquerading as fact. It was a story that would be read by other officers, by prosecutors, by potentially a jury. It was a story that would inform decisions about Marcus Webb's future. And it was almost entirely fabricated. The next morning, Marcus was transferred from the holding cell to a more permanent jail facility. The space was larger, but worse in some ways. A dormitory-style cell with multiple bunks, multiple men, multiple stories of how people ended up here. Some of them were hardened criminals. Some of them, like Marcus, were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some of them had simply been born in circumstances that made it more likely they'd end up here. The mixing of all of these people in one space created a kind of background tension that never fully dissipated. Marcus was assigned a bunk and given a uniform. The orange jumpsuit was designed to mark him as something other than human. It was designed to diminish him, to strip away identity and replace it with designation. He was no longer Marcus Webb, retired professional. He was prisoner 4782. The hours moved slowly in jail. The days moved even slower. Time seemed to function differently here. Elastic, stretched, impossible to measure with any accuracy. Marcus spent his hours in a state of controlled anxiety. He knew that his lawyer would handle things. He knew that the charges were fabricated and would eventually be dismissed. But he also knew that in the meantime, he was at the mercy of a system that had already proven itself corrupt. On the second day, a public defender, a harried-looking woman named Sarah Chen, came to meet with him in the holding area. She had a file in her hands and a concerned expression on her face. "Let's go over these charges," Chen said, sitting across from him at a metal table bolted to the floor. "You've got possession with intent to distribute resisting arrest and failure to obey. The first one is the heavy one." "Those charges are completely false," Marcus said. "I wasn't driving erratically, I wasn't rude or aggressive, and there was no marijuana in my car. This officer fabricated everything." Chen made notes. "Okay, that's good to know. Here's the thing, though. His word against yours is going to be difficult. He's a police officer. You're a... What do you do for work?" "I'm retired now," Marcus said. "But I worked in business, management. Nothing glamorous." "Okay," Chen said. "Well, the thing is, judges tend to believe police officers, unless we have some evidence that contradicts the officer's account. And I mean actual evidence like dashcam footage or other witnesses. It's going to be an uphill battle." "What about the bail hearing?" Marcus asked. "That's tomorrow morning," Chen said. "The prosecutor will ask for bail. I'll ask for you to be released on your own recognizance. Your record is clean, which is good. You have stable housing, no history of missing court dates. I think we can make a reasonable argument." "And if bail is set high?" Marcus asked. "We deal with it," Chen said. "Have someone post it, friends, family, whoever. But honestly, Mr. Webb, something feels off about this case. Something about the way the charges are written, the way the officer describes events. I don't know yet what it is, but I'm going to look into it. For now, just try to stay calm. These things take time." The bail hearing the next morning was a process that Marcus had only ever read about. He was brought into a courtroom. The prosecutor, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and sharper words, stood at the podium and described Marcus as a potential danger to the community. She talked about the drug charges. She talked about his erratic behavior and his refusal to cooperate. She painted him as exactly the kind of person bail was designed to keep off the streets. Marcus's lawyer, Chen, stood and argued that his client was a longtime community member with no history of criminality, no reason to flee, and a legitimate grievance about the nature of the charges. She asked for his release on his own recognizance. The judge, an older man named Caldwell with gray hair and a judicial robe that had probably seen 1,000 cases exactly like this one, looked at the two arguments, then looked at Marcus. For just a moment, something flickered in the judge's expression. Something that might have been recognition. Something that might have meant something. "Bail is set at $5,000, the judge announced. "Next case." It was fast. It was businesslike. It was exactly the kind of swift processing that happened to thousands of people every day. What made this case different? What made Marcus different? Wouldn't become apparent until much later. Marcus's daughter posted his bail that afternoon. He was released from custody with instructions to appear at his next scheduled court date. He walked out of the facility into bright sunlight that felt artificial after the fluorescent lighting inside. The air smelled like freedom, or at least what he imagined freedom smelled like. That evening he sat in his daughter's living room with his grandchildren playing with their toys nearby, not fully understanding why Grandpa looked so tired and sad. His daughter made dinner, and they ate together. And Marcus recounted the entire ordeal, every detail, every fabrication, every injustice. "You need to fight this," his daughter said, her voice tight with anger on his behalf. "This isn't right. This is insane." "I will," Marcus assured her. "My lawyer is good. We'll get through it." But inside, Marcus felt something he didn't want to feel. He felt afraid. He felt vulnerable. He felt the weight of a system that had decided he was guilty regardless of the facts, and he understood in a way he hadn't fully before how dangerous that system was. 2 weeks later, Marcus was back in the same courtroom for a preliminary hearing. The prosecution presented its case. Officer Jenkins testified, describing Marcus's behavior in ways that bore almost no resemblance to reality. He talked about erratic driving that hadn't happened. He talked about aggressive refusals to comply that hadn't occurred. He talked about the smell of marijuana that hadn't existed. Jenkins was calm. Jenkins was confident. Jenkins had every reason to be confident. He knew the system. He knew that his word was currency here. He knew that his badge carried weight. He knew that even if someone contradicted him, the default assumption was that he was telling the truth. When Chen cross-examined Jenkins, she was careful and methodical. She asked about the dash cam footage. Jenkins admitted it had malfunctioned. She asked about his specific observations that led to the stop. Jenkins backtracked slightly, admitting that the initial stop had been based on general suspicious behavior. She asked him to describe this suspicious behavior with specificity. Jenkins fumbled, providing vague descriptions that could apply to anyone. But the judge, the same Judge Caldwell who had looked at Marcus with something that might have been recognition, listened to all of this with an expression that grew increasingly cold. At the end of the hearing, Judge Caldwell ruled that there was insufficient probable cause for the charges. All of Marcus's charges were dismissed. He was free to go. Jenkins, sitting at the prosecution table, looked stunned. Officers didn't lose cases like this. The system didn't turn on them. The system protected them. But Judge Caldwell wasn't done. Before concluding the hearing, he made a statement from the bench. "Officer Jenkins," Judge Caldwell said, his voice carrying a weight that made the entire courtroom fall silent. "The testimony you provided today does not align with any reasonable interpretation of the events you described. I find it implausible. Your body camera data, which you claimed was unavailable, is required to be preserved. I am requesting that Law Enforcement Department immediately locate that data and provide it to both the court and the defense counsel. I'm also requesting a complete file review of Officer Jenkins's conduct record, including any complaints that have been filed against him. This case is dismissed with prejudice, meaning these charges cannot be refiled. Mr. Webb, you are free to go, and you have my apologies for the time you've spent in custody based on insufficient evidence." The next weeks were strange for Marcus. He was technically free, but the ordeal wasn't over. His lawyer was pursuing additional avenues, filing complaints with the police department, requesting his record be expunged, investigating Jenkins's history. She was building a case. What neither of them knew yet was that Judge Caldwell was doing more than just presiding over Marcus's case. Caldwell had made a phone call. Caldwell had made an inquiry, and what Caldwell had discovered was going to change everything. The missing dashcam footage was found. Recovered through a forensic IT team, the video showed exactly what Marcus had described. Careful driving, perfect lane positioning, no traffic violations, no erratic behavior. The footage then showed Jenkins's approach, the tailgating, the aggressive interaction. The footage showed a traffic stop with no legal basis. As the video was reviewed, more inquiries were made into Jenkins's record. What emerged was a pattern. Over the course of his 12-year career, Jenkins had been the subject of 14 excessive force complaints. 9 of them involved minorities. All of them had been mysteriously dismissed or settled quietly by a police union that protected its own. The pattern was undeniable, but there was more, much more. Detective Wright, a woman in the department who had been quietly investigating misconduct for the past year, was brought in by leadership. She began pulling together documentation. Jenkins's personal phone records were obtained through legal channels. Text messages between Jenkins and other officers emerged. Messages suggesting quotas. Messages suggesting that certain neighborhoods were easy pickings. Messages suggesting racial bias. One text between Jenkins and another officer read, "Lang wants 12 stops this week. Midlothian is easy pickings. Soccer moms don't lawyer up." Another message from Jenkins to an unknown number discovered in an investigation into an unrelated complaint read, "She complained. Don't worry. Union will handle it." The evidence was mounting. It was becoming clear that Jenkins's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger culture, and it was becoming clear that someone in the department had the authority to do something about it. Marcus knew none of this. He was going about his normal life, driving, spending time with his family, returning to routines that had been interrupted by his arrest. He hadn't filed a lawsuit. He hadn't made a big public case of things. As far as he was concerned, the matter was resolved. The charges were dismissed. He was free. His lawyer called him one afternoon with unexpected news. "The department is conducting an internal investigation into Officer Jenkins," his lawyer said. "They're looking at a broader pattern of misconduct. They want to talk to you. They want to understand what happened during your stop. They want to make sure they have everything they need for what might become a larger case." Marcus agreed to meet with investigators. He sat in a room and described his experience in detail. He talked about the tailgating. He talked about being ordered out of his vehicle without legal justification. He talked about the illegal search. He talked about the fabricated charges. He talked about his 2 weeks in custody for crimes he hadn't committed. He talked about the humiliation. He talked about the fear. The investigators took notes. They asked clarifying questions. They seemed to take his complaint seriously in a way that had been absent before. 2 months after his arrest, Marcus received notification that he had been granted an expungement. His arrest record would be sealed and essentially erased. But the investigation into Jenkins was proceeding independently now. The department was preparing a case that went well beyond Marcus Webb's single interaction with a corrupt officer. A week before Marcus's official expungement hearing was scheduled to take place, he received a letter in the mail. The letterhead was official. The content was brief. He was being requested to appear as a witness in an official hearing regarding Officer Jenkins. The hearing was set for the following week. He was requested to arrive at 9 a.m. sharp. Marcus had no idea what he was walking into. He had no idea that his interaction with a corrupt officer was about to become the focal point of a much larger inquiry. He had no idea that the next few hours of his life were going to fundamentally alter the power dynamics that had haunted him since his arrest. He drove to the courthouse on the morning of the hearing. The building was large and imposing, made of marble and stone and granite. It had the weight of institutional authority built into its very structure. Inside, corridors stretched in multiple directions. People moved purposefully, wearing suits and carrying briefcases. Lawyers, judges, clerks, all of them moving through a system that had learned over centuries how to perpetuate itself. Marcus was directed to a hearing room by a court clerk who seemed to know exactly who he was and exactly where he needed to go. That was strange. The clerk hadn't asked his name. The clerk had just pointed and said, "This way, sir." The hearing room was a formal space with high ceilings and polished wood tables. At the front, elevated above everything else, was the judge's bench. Behind it, Judge Caldwell sat reviewing documents. Beside the bench was a court reporter ready to document everything that was said. To Marcus's right was a prosecution table where two people sat in conversation. To his left was a defense table where Officer Jenkins sat with his attorney. A sharp-eyed man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd been hired to protect Officer Jenkins at any cost. Marcus was sworn in. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Then he sat in the witness stand, a small enclosed space designed to isolate the witness from the rest of the courtroom, designed to make them feel vulnerable and exposed. The prosecutor stood and approached him. "Mr. Webb, can you walk us through the evening of your traffic stop?" Marcus began to speak. He described the drive. He described the tailgating. He described the siren and the lights. He described being ordered out of his vehicle. He described the illegal search. He described being arrested on fabricated charges. He described the 2 weeks in custody. Each detail was met with follow-up questions designed to establish the truth of what had happened. As he spoke, Judge Caldwell listened with an expression of cold clarity. Caldwell knew exactly what was happening here. Caldwell knew the context that Marcus didn't yet know, and Caldwell was waiting for exactly the right moment. Jenkins's attorney stood for cross-examination. He tried to suggest that Marcus might have misremembered events. He tried to suggest that his client had acted appropriately. He tried to create doubt. But Marcus was clear. Marcus was precise. Marcus's account was consistent. And, most importantly, Marcus had the evidence on his side. The recovered dashcam footage that corroborated every word he said. As the defense attorney continued, Judge Caldwell interrupted. "I think we have sufficient testimony on this matter," Caldwell said. "Officer Jenkins, you'll have an opportunity to respond. But before we proceed to that, I have a statement to make." The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Judge Caldwell leaned forward slightly. His expression hardened. "Mr. Webb, what you have described is a series of constitutional violations so egregious that I find myself questioning how we arrived at this point in our legal system. You were stopped without probable cause. You were searched without consent. You were arrested on fabricated charges, and your credibility was attacked by a system designed to protect the person who harmed you." Caldwell then turned to Jenkins. "Officer Jenkins, I have reviewed your record. I have reviewed the recovered dashcam footage. I have reviewed the text messages that were obtained during the internal investigation. What I see is not an isolated incident. I see a pattern of behavior that suggests a profound disregard for the constitutional rights of the citizens you were sworn to protect." Caldwell paused. The silence in the courtroom became suffocating. I am recommending criminal charges be filed against you for false imprisonment, abuse of authority, and falsification of official records. I am also recommending your immediate suspension pending the outcome of those charges. Your badge and weapon are to be surrendered immediately upon conclusion of this hearing. You are in custody of this court." Jenkins's face went white. His attorney stood abruptly, saying something about appeals and due process, but the words seemed to bounce off the walls uselessly. Jenkins understood exactly what was happening. His career was ending. His freedom was ending. Everything he'd built was collapsing. As Jenkins was led from the courtroom by court officers who had been prepared for exactly this outcome, Marcus felt something shift inside him. Not triumph, not exactly satisfaction. What Marcus felt was a kind of validation. What Marcus felt was the acknowledgement that what had been done to him was wrong. What Marcus felt was the knowledge that the system, however imperfectly, was capable of recognizing that wrong and holding someone accountable for it. But Marcus also understood something else. What had made this possible? What had made Judge Caldwell's intervention possible was that Marcus had resources. Marcus had a lawyer. Marcus had a judge who was willing to look carefully at the evidence. Marcus had a voice that was ultimately heard. How many people, Marcus wondered, experienced exactly what he had experienced, but never had their charges dismissed? How many people sat in jail cells unable to afford a good attorney, unable to convince a judge that the charges against them were fabricated? How many Jenkinses out there were walking free, still wearing their badges, still abusing their authority, because the people they harmed didn't have a Marcus Webb's resources? The cascade of consequences that followed Jenkins's arrest moved with a speed and force that seemed to catch everyone off guard. By the end of the day, the story was on local news. By the evening, it was spreading to regional media. By the next morning, it had reached national outlets. A police officer arrested for falsely imprisoning an innocent man. A corrupt system exposed, a pattern of misconduct revealed. But the story was about to become much bigger than that. Within hours of Jenkins's arrest, the police department received inquiries from federal authorities. The FBI had been monitoring patterns in the department's conduct. Officers making stops in certain neighborhoods with inexplicable frequency. Vehicles being towed at disproportionate rates from those same neighborhoods. Money flowing into private towing companies. It began to look like something larger than individual corruption. It began to look like institutional corruption. Detectives, including Detective Wright, began pulling together evidence with a fury. They discovered not just Jenkins's misconduct, but a broader pattern. Officers were being incentivized to make stops in specific neighborhoods where towing companies with connections to the police department itself, would profit. Quotas were being enforced. Neighborhoods where residents were less likely to have lawyers or resources to fight charges were being targeted. The towing company Metro Towing was being enriched by this arrangement. The owner of Metro Towing had connections to the police department. Officers who exceeded their quotas received bonuses. A union that was supposed to protect officers from unfair treatment was instead protecting them from accountability. Jenkins, sitting in a cell awaiting trial, understood that his arrest had opened a door that couldn't be closed. The investigation that had begun with him was now expanding to encompass something much larger. Marcus, watching this unfold from his home, where he'd returned to a life that was almost normal but still carried the weight of what had happened, understood that his personal experience had become part of something greater. His suffering, his humiliation, his 2 weeks in custody, all of it had exposed a cancer in the system that had seemed before almost impossible to see. The media coverage reached a crescendo. The Washington Post ran a story. The ACLU issued statements. Federal civil rights organizations called for investigations. Politicians began making statements about accountability and reform. Captain Victor Lang, who had been implicated in the quota system, announced his resignation as union president. He issued a statement through his attorney saying something about administrative oversight and no criminal intent. But the words rang hollow. 3 other officers, including the one who had arrived as backup during Marcus's stop, were suspended pending investigation. The chief of police held a press conference where he promised a thorough investigation into the department's practices. He promised reforms. He promised accountability. He promised that the system would be fixed. But promises are easy. Implementation is harder. What mattered was what happened next. A criminal case was prepared against Jenkins. The evidence was overwhelming. The recovered dashcam footage, the text messages, Marcus's testimony, other officers who were beginning to cooperate with investigators in exchange for reduced charges, the fabricated police reports, all of it painted a picture of deliberate, calculated misconduct. Jenkins's case went to trial 6 months later. The trial was brief. The evidence was so compelling that Jenkins's attorney didn't even bother calling witnesses. There was nothing to say. There was nothing that could be said that would change the fundamental reality of what Jenkins had done. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. On the charge of false imprisonment under color of law, we find the defendant, Bryce Jenkins, guilty. On the charge of official misconduct, guilty. On the charge of falsification of official records, guilty. Jenkins's face collapsed. He'd convinced himself up until that moment that the system would protect him, that his badge would shield him, that the power he'd wielded for so long was real enough to protect him from consequences. He'd been wrong. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. The judge, a different judge, Judge Clarence Stevens, who was known for taking officer misconduct seriously, looked down from the bench at Jenkins with an expression of absolute disdain. "Officer Jenkins," Judge Stevens said, his voice cold and final. "You have violated the public trust in the most fundamental way possible. You used the authority granted to you by the state to terrorize an innocent citizen. You fabricated evidence. You falsified official reports. You corrupted the very system you were sworn to uphold. I sentence you to 8 years in the state penitentiary. Upon your release, you are permanently decertified from law enforcement." 8 years. It wasn't a life sentence. It was finite. But it was also substantial enough to recognize the gravity of what Jenkins had done. Jenkins would spend years in prison, in facilities where he would encounter people he'd arrested over his career, people who would remember him, people who would have their own reasons to be angry with him. As the bailiffs moved to collect Jenkins, as they applied handcuffs with the same kind of mechanical efficiency Jenkins had once used to restrain Marcus, something shifted in the courtroom. There was an almost audible sense of relief. Not because Jenkins's conviction had solved anything, not because it had fixed the broader problems that had enabled his behavior, but because it had confirmed something that sometimes seemed questionable in this country, that accountability was possible, that even someone with power could be held to account. Jenkins was led from the courtroom. He didn't look back at Marcus. He didn't acknowledge the man whose life he'd tried to destroy. He was led away to begin serving his sentence. Marcus watched him go. And Marcus felt nothing like triumph. Marcus felt something more complex. Marcus felt the weight of what had happened. Marcus felt the understanding that for every person like him who had resources and luck and a judge willing to listen, there were hundreds of people who didn't have those things. People sitting in cells right now, facing charges based on the same kind of lies Jenkins had told. Over the following months, the investigation expanded. The department's practices were examined. Civilian oversight was established. Policy changes were implemented. Mandatory body cameras for all officers. Quota systems were officially prohibited. Bias training was mandated. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't complete. But it was real. The quota system that had enriched Metro towing was dismantled. The towing company lost its city contract. Civil suits were filed by multiple victims of the same pattern of misconduct that had targeted Marcus. Settlements were reached. Money changed hands. Not as compensation. No amount of money could truly compensate for the violation and humiliation, but as acknowledgement that harm had been done. Marcus was invited to testify before the city council about his experience. He considered it carefully. He didn't want to be a symbol. He didn't want his suffering to be exploited for political purposes. But he also understood that his voice carried weight now. His experience was documented. His case had broken something open. The night before his testimony, Marcus sat in his home office and thought about what he would say. He thought about the terror of those first moments with Jenkins. He thought about the helplessness of sitting in a jail cell. He thought about the vindication of having the charges dismissed. He thought about watching Jenkins convicted, and he thought about all of the people who would never have that vindication. The city council hearing was formal and procedural. Marcus sat in front of the council members and told his story. He didn't speak with rage. He didn't demand revenge. He spoke with precision and clarity. He talked about what had happened. He talked about how it had affected him and his family. He talked about the broader nature of the problem, how his case wasn't unique, how it was part of a pattern, how the system itself needed to change, not just the individual officer. "I'm fortunate," Marcus said at the conclusion of his testimony. "I have resources that many people don't have. I have an education. I have a professional background that gave me some credibility. I have a lawyer who fought for me. But what Officer Jenkins did to me, he's done to others. And many of them didn't have what I had. Many of them are still sitting in cells. Many of them have criminal records they can't get expunged. Many of them have lost years of their lives because the system failed them." The council voted on reforms. They voted on mandatory body cameras. They voted on civilian oversight. They voted on bias investigation protocols. The votes weren't unanimous, but they passed. The system wasn't being fixed. Systems that entrenched are never fixed in a day or a week or a month, but it was changing. Several months later, Marcus was driving on the same stretch of highway where Jenkins had pulled him over. It was a different season now. The trees were in full leaf. The highway was busy with afternoon traffic. He was simply driving, heading back from a meeting with his lawyer about another case. Not his case. Someone else's case. A person Marcus had agreed to help testify for based on his own experience. A patrol car appeared behind him. Marcus felt a moment of tension. Old fears die slowly. But the officer who approached was young and professional. When the officer recognized Marcus during the interaction, and the officer did recognize him, the story had made local news. The officer's entire demeanor changed. "Mr. Webb," the officer said, his voice respectful. "I'm going to let you go. You weren't speeding anyway. I just wanted to make sure everything was okay, and I wanted to say that I'm sorry for what happened to you. That was wrong. And I want you to know that's not who we're trying to be as a department anymore. It was a small moment. It was just an interaction between a driver and an officer. But it represented something. It represented the possibility of change. It represented the understanding that people were watching, that accountability mattered, that the system, however slowly and imperfectly, could shift." Marcus drove away. And for the first time since his arrest, he felt something like peace. Not complete peace. Not the erasure of what had happened, but the peace that comes from knowing that what happened to you mattered, that it meant something, that it had contributed to change that might protect someone else. That evening, Marcus sat with his family at dinner. His grandchildren were telling him about their day at school. His daughter was talking about a case she was working on at her hospital. His son-in-law was talking about his job. It was ordinary. It was the kind of evening that had almost been lost to him. It was the kind of life that is easy to take for granted until it's threatened. "Dad," his daughter said, "I saw an article today about how many people have had their charges dismissed because of the investigation into Jenkins and the department. It said over 40 cases have been reviewed and 23 charges have been completely dismissed." Marcus nodded. He had seen the articles too. He knew the numbers. He knew that 23 was good. But it was also such a small number compared to how many people had been harmed over the years by officers like Jenkins. They're saying Jenkins's conviction might have changed the entire department. His daughter continued. "That because of what happened to you. Because you fought back, other people are getting second chances. Because I had the resources to fight back," Marcus corrected gently. "That's an important distinction. It shouldn't take someone with education and money to get justice." "But it's something," his daughter said. "It's change. And that's because of you." Marcus didn't feel like a hero. Heroes are born fully formed. Heroes know what they're doing. Marcus had simply been a man trying to survive an unjust situation. He'd been lucky. He'd been heard. Those things had led to consequences, but there was no heroism in it. There was just the intersection of circumstance and timing and luck. Late that night, Marcus stood in his study looking at the pictures on his wall. Pictures of family, pictures of milestones, pictures of ordinary life captured in moments. And he thought about what could have happened if Judge Caldwell hadn't been paying attention. What could have happened if the dash cam footage hadn't been recovered. What could have happened if he'd accepted a plea deal to charges he hadn't committed just to end the ordeal. He thought about the people sitting in cells right now facing choices exactly like that. He thought about the system that had nearly crushed him and that continues to crush others. He thought about the slow, difficult work of building accountability into institutions that profit from opacity. And he made a decision. The next week, Marcus began volunteering with a legal aid organization. He started helping people who were facing charges based on police misconduct. He used his platform, the platform that his case had given him, to advocate for people who didn't have his resources. He told his story over and over, not because he enjoyed reliving it, but because he understood that his experience broadcast widely might help someone else, might give someone else hope that the system, however broken, could be made to work. Years passed. Jenkins served his sentence. He was released and immediately moved out of state. He never wore a police badge again. The department underwent significant changes. Some of them stuck, some of them didn't. Reform is slow and incomplete. But progress, however incremental, is still progress. Marcus continued his work. He continued driving on the highways and streets of his community. He continued living the ordinary life that had been threatened but never fully taken from him. And he continued to understand that what had happened to him, the arrest, the jail time, the vindication, was ultimately not about him. It was about everyone who came after him. It was about the system, however slowly learning to be more just. The final image comes not in a moment of triumph, but in quiet continuity. Marcus is driving on that same highway. The seasons have changed multiple times now. His hair is grayer. His bearing is the same. Dignified, careful, aware. A patrol car approaches. Marcus's heart rate spikes slightly. Old fear. But this time the officer waves, just a greeting. Officer and civilian, passing each other in the ordinary business of living. The officer recognizes Marcus from the news. The officer appreciates what Marcus did. The officer lets him go. And Marcus continues driving. He drives toward home, toward family, toward the ordinary life that he fought to preserve. Behind him, the patrol car continues in a different direction. Around them, both the system continues its slow work of becoming slightly better. Not perfect. Never perfect, but better. Because one man refused to disappear. Because one man had resources and luck and used them to push for change. Because the system, however reluctantly, can be held accountable. Justice is not swift. Justice is not complete. But justice in the end is possible. And sometimes that possibility is enough. If you've made it this far in the story, you understand something fundamental about this country. You understand that the system is broken in particular ways that harm particular people. But you also understand that change is possible, that accountability is possible, that when we pay attention, when we insist on truth, when we fight back against corruption, things can shift. Don't look away. Don't accept injustice as inevitable. Don't assume that because the system is powerful, it cannot be challenged. Marcus Webb didn't look away, and because he didn't, other people got chances they might not have had. Other people got to go home to their families instead of sitting in cells for crimes they didn't commit. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one. Stories about people who fought back. Stories about the possibilities of accountability. Stories about a country that's broken but not beyond repair. Subscribe and share these stories with others, because patterns only change when people refuse to look away.